Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, April 28th, 2004, a CBS 60 Minutes 2 story aired here in the United States reporting on the abuse of prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. I think most people listening have some sense of what was taking place at Abu Ghraib, particularly since this report included those searing images of prisoners being tortured and humiliated, including those photos of American soldiers smiling alongside hooded Iraqi prisoners. The 60 Minutes report caused a sensation in the United States, a cascade of further reports about what was taking place inside the prison. The same day that the report aired, Defense Secretary Donald H. Rumsfeld briefed Congress on an internal government report about the abuse. Over the coming months, Amnesty International would issue a report of their own criticizing the, quote, cruel, inhumane, or degrading acts at the prison. Further reporting would make it clear that Americans were involved in human rights violations and that American leadership knew about what was taking place inside that prison. So let's talk about this key moment in the Iraq War. And honestly, I have some bigger things to say about this moment and how it relates, to American empire and American standing and morality in the world. But we'll get there. For now, let's welcome, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Tough topic, really, tough moment. I think we all remember it. I want to start with timeline because one of the striking things to me looking back at this story, I don't know if you have the same sort of take, but is, this is April 2004. The invasion of Iraq was May 2003. I mean, I don't know, to put it crudely, we got to torturing really fast. It's just, I was stunned by this. Not that it would excuse it if it was 5 years into a grinding war or whatever, but gosh, I don't think I really understood how quickly this kind of dark stuff was happening, basically immediately.
I think it underscores the centrality of that terrorism framework or mindset to the approach that was taken for this war, that the people that end up being in Abu Ghraib must be people who in some way are responsible for the attacks on September 11th or the death of American soldiers, and therefore need to be treated in that kind of, the television show 24, in that 24 style way. And cultural products like 24 are feeding into this idea that this is the way that you treat quote unquote dangerous people.
To me, I think what's most telling is the fact that Abu Ghraib was a prison before the United States gets there. And it was a notorious prison in which Saddam Hussein was known for torturing Iraqi citizens. And it was a place that no one wanted to go. And when the United States gets there, they essentially take the prison and they refurbish it. And they make it their own military prison to house anyone that they sort of suspect or know of doing, terrorist acts. But very quickly, as you said, the holding of these prisoners becomes abusive. It becomes barbaric. It becomes sadistic. And I don't know how you could, one, participate in these acts, but two, the fact that it became also performative, that people were taking pictures next to bodies and people were smiling, taking pictures next to those bodies. That this was not just an act of aggression, but it was also an act that was fraught with pleasure that just did not sit right either.
Yeah. I'm curious, Kellie, does it remind you of those lynching photos from the late 19th and early 20th century?
Absolutely. When you think about the mob mentality and when you have a person that is being harmed or violated or murdered and people are taking pictures to send back home, using them as postcards, using them as sort of tallies, counting up how many, their body counts that they have. It is atrocious. And yet somehow within that space, it is sanctioned. It is deemed appropriate behavior.
And sanctioned in more than just that space, right? This is an era in which you have the torture memos being drafted, where you have a sort of sanction for sort of extensive use of torture and other abuses of power, but also CIA black sites across Europe and the Middle East. So this wasn't just kind of spontaneous torture. It was institutionalized in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not only just institutionalized and sanctioned, but, I would say planned and kind of intended, right? I mean, that's the thing that I think catches me about the timeline here, and just an understanding the more and more we sort of think about the Iraq War, was that the torture memos were written in 2002, right? Before the war. Dick Cheney was, thinking about how to bend the rules of war crimes and torture before the war, not as a response to the war going badly. And so, going into the war, it was already expected that the U.S. would engage in and have to engage in behavior like this. Again, not to say that had it been done in sort of reaction to the war going badly, it would have been any less horrific. But I do think this is kind of the U.S. doing what it intended to do, I think, is one of the big things that you realize in this story. I want to get back to TikTok of how these images came out and the impact they had. But I do think, Niki, I'm so glad you asked about the photos in particular, because a big part of this story was obviously the impact of photos, and it's a reminder how much kind of visual evidence makes a story break through. But then also these individual U.S. soldiers who were put in, who were prison guards, they became household names. They were the ones who were kind of often the controversy was about, this woman who was smiling or giving a thumbs up or whatever. And Kellie, how do you think about, if we want to talk about some of those lynching photos or whatever, how do you think about the individuals who are in those photos who are often smiling or part of a spectacle versus the larger context of, how they ended up there? I mean, should we feel like these are awful individuals and look at how they're behaving? Yes,
and I think that these are also state sanctioned. I mean, when you look at the lynchings that took place, it wasn't just a community that went awry. The policing forces did nothing to stop this kind of heinous act. And oftentimes elected officials and cops are there and ministers are there. People in the community that are highly respected are there at the lynching too. So what do you do when all the way from the top down, the people who are supposed to be sort of enforcing this either are complicit in it or sort of sort of wash their hands of it and say, okay, I'm not going to take part, I'm not going to watch. But they're still, in some ways, approving this behavior. And I feel like that's what happened at Abu Ghraib as well. I'm sure there were people there who did not endorse it, who did not want to be a part of it. But the culture, I think, and the command and the leadership supported, directly or indirectly, that kind of behavior, or at least did not shut it down the moment that they saw it.
Yeah, it's interesting, right, that people like Lindy England became household names in this period because, yes, they were the people in the images that we saw. It was so easy to individualize it once we made them household names, right? Once we had two or three people who we could attach these crimes to, then all of a sudden it was about them, and it was a lot less about Vice President Dick Cheney, who, obviously had a big hand in this as well. And so if you can find those, they're not scapegoats because they were actually doing the torture, but they were sacrificed so that the people up the chain could
They became
continue.
The face, they became the literal poster or the face of the person who is the number one, abuser, or the number one person who's at fault. Yeah. But this was a massive failure at all levels. And I think that's what's so astonishing, not just that it happened, but for how long it happened. The fact that, multiple people had died, women were being sexually assaulted, children were being sexually assaulted. And there was no stop put to this until, you get this 60 minutes expose.
Right, and it still takes a bit after that. But coming back to this, this timeline, I suppose, and the 60 minutes expose, I mean, the 60 Minutes expose is, I think, two things. One, it is a report on an internal report that was circulating among the U.S. government that had been written up in, I think, November of 2003. So even sooner after the invasion, right? There were already reports saying, look, there's some stuff going on at Abu Ghraib that really is, needs some attention. And then, of course, the images in that report were the thing that pushed it through. But, to be clear, both within the U.S. government and in some media, there were already conversations about what was happening at this prison. And so I guess it's important to point out that there were parts of the U.S. government, at least, that were objecting or writing a pretty searing report. It's this 50-some page document that was circulating that was calling out what was happening there. But clearly, I don't think until the images leaked, the U.S. government wasn't going to actually act on it.
And somebody is leaking those images. They understand that the report itself isn't going to move the needle enough, I think. It's actually really interesting. If we fast forward a few years later when Barack Obama becomes president, he declassifies the torture memos, but he, the next month, refuses to declassify more photos from Abu Ghraib because he knows that that is going to inflame so many people, and it's so much more powerful than a document saying that the U.S. okayed torture.
Yeah.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
That report, by the way, was written by General Antonio Taguba, and he, said he would catalog sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses of Iraqis by American soldiers. It's a secret report, and, it seems to have reached the highest levels. And then on the day that this story breaks on 60 Minutes 2, it is that report that Rumsfeld briefs Congress on, and it, launches this big conversation.
Isn't it wild that it's on 60 Minutes too? I kind of feel like it deserves to be on the main show.
I know. I was just thinking that. And I should have gone back and looked. I have the sense that 60 Minutes 2 aired midweek, and it may have been just that they wanted to run it. They couldn't wait until Sunday to run it or something. And also it was just at that time, network TV was still huge enough that if it's on network. But I think it was something like that because there was a big, there's a media element here too, and a media TikTok. The New Yorker was getting ready to write up a big piece. Cy Hirsch was going to write up a big piece about the Taguba memo, and so I think that's why 60 Minutes rushed it, but then they got these photos and, yada, yada, yada.
And 60 Minutes had been holding the story at the request of the Defense Department, which often happens in cases of, if it's seen as part of national security or national defense, that sometimes media organizations will hold things for a while.
Yeah.
And we should also say that, 60 Minutes does kind of catch fire for this. I mean, people are upset that they have undermined the war effort by exposing these kind of images, that people are afraid that, will we somehow lose our morale or lose momentum or lose hearts and minds, as it was sort of the language of the day. But I mean, my goodness, you certainly weren't winning hearts and minds over in Iraq. A lot of the anger and the resentment and the backlash from those torturous conditions at the prison were a lot of the reasons why you continue to see unrest.
Yeah. Right.
Senator Jim Inhofe was the way that he responds to this. I'm probably not the only one at the table that is more outraged by the outrage than we are by the treatment. And that's a pretty big statement. He went on to explain that he felt, these were bad people who deserve to be treated badly. So why is everyone so upset?
Yeah. Well, Jim Inhofe, I think he's a piece of work. Let's just put it that way. That guy. There's a lot to be said about him.
Don't you have to ask real questions about how you see your opposition or how you see other human beings, how you see children of any ethnic background, of any socioeconomic status, how you treat a person? Even, an animal. We've talked about this cruelty to animals on the show. The very basic decency of how you interact, regardless of all that's going on. It's just none of this met that bar. I mean, prison is awful as it is, but to be in prison and then to be, tortured, sexually humiliated, violated in all kinds of ways, just it does not bode well. It does not bode well for when you think about what happens when the war is over, because it can't go on forever. Like, what kind of relationships do you want to have with these other countries? And
that goes back to the original sin of the war, which was, it was thought of at the highest levels as a just war and a holy war in many senses, and that we would be greeted as liberators, and the ends would justify the means, and there was just no foresight and no humanity in the thinking. But yeah, and this dark irony that the very thing that people were kind of trying. I mean, there's former CIA chief is kind of quoted as saying, Abu Ghraib, what Saddam Hussein was doing under Abu Ghraib justified us getting rid of him. All the abuses that he was doing at Abu Ghraib, were the reason that we need to get rid of people like Saddam Hussein. And then, of course, the dark irony of the fact that we go in there and just do exactly that and basically just, continue the project of that prison.
Yeah.
And so, but there's no context, there's no humanity. And also, like, that Inhofe quote is so fascinating because he says, I'm not the only one who has to be more outraged by the outrage than by the treatment. And just like that kind of language. The other thing that Rumsfeld says on the day that this breaks is he's talking to the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he says, what has been charged so far is abuse, which I believe is technically different from torture. And I'm not going to address the torture word. And I just, I want to remind people of the Orwellian language, right? And especially from Rumsfeld, right? Who would do the whole, like, what was Rumsfeld's thing? Known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And all that. It's just like taking people back to this time period where people were playing these rhetorical games and and just not seeing the sort of baseline, the baseline morality at the heart of it.
Which is wild, because like abuse is okay, but torture is not. Like, and what's the line? Do you know what I mean?
There was a memo just for that. Yeah.
What do we?
I'm sure they're one of those little memos. But yet I think that the difference is abuse is something that happens outside of the rules, and torture is something that was happening inside of the rules. So whether it's sanctioned or not, I think is how it gets perceived. And Jody, you mentioned at the very beginning this kind of broader conversation about American empire, but it's so fascinating how quickly the U.S. went from having international support after 2001, even with sometimes foes, right? Countries that were willing to work with the United States, both because they understood the pain that had been inflicted on the U.S., but they also feared, how the U.S. might respond. So thinking about the ways that the U.S. and Iran had opportunities to work together in 2001 and 2002, but that's squandered in so many ways, so much so that the U.S. it's probably too much to call it a pariah state by 2008, but it loses any sort of moral authority that it might have gained after the attack. And this is one of those places where they just drain it all away.
I would be willing to argue that this is like possibly the key moment. I think obviously there's a big story you could write about kind of the decline of U.S. empire and certainly the erosion of the U.S. as the moral arbiter of the world. You could write that story probably starting in the 70s, right? But maybe earlier. But I certainly think the Iraq War and then Abu Ghraib specifically is a huge turn. I think it's hard to overstate how much that may have been the sort of final nail in the coffin for a lot of the world and for a lot of Americans in terms of just kind of this baseline expectation that we are moral and just, And I think, not to get too big think here, but, you look at a lot of surveys and you look at a lot of the ways that, Americans under 40 think about institutions. And I think one of the big stories is that kind of fundamental faith is eroding and, possibly gone. And I think that's one of the defining features of our age. And this has a huge part in it. Yeah.
One other thing worth pointing out, though, is that, this happens in April and May of 2004 in the middle of a presidential election. And George W. Bush does better in 2004 than he did in 2000. It really takes a while for there to be an erosion of support for George W. Bush. And this does not move the needle domestically in the way that one might hope that
despite,
And
scandal,
that's terrifying, right? Like, what else do you need in order to be convinced?
I think part of it is, and this is the way that those photos cut both ways, is those photos are the thing that helps it break through, but those photos are also the thing that everyone gloms onto. And who's in those photos? It's individuals, right? And it's not it's not it doesn't initially read as systemic, right? And to be clear, there are calls to clean house. You know, Al Gore gives this huge speech in May of 2004 where he basically he says that the entire national security apparatus should resign. He says that Rumsfeld and Condoleezza Rice and Tenet and Wolfowitz and Feith and all these names that people are flooding back to people as I say them, that they should all resign. But yeah, I think to many Americans and clearly to many voters come the fall election, this was about those soldiers in those photos and about a bunch of rogue individuals, which certainly was one of the ways in which the U.S. government tried to frame this. It's like, I don't think they used the phrase bad apples, but it was certainly, there was that vibe in there as well, even as more and more reports came out of more and more horrific abuses. Cut all the way to 2010, the prison actually gets turned back over to the Iraqi government, and then in 2014 it's closed indefinitely. But in those years in between, what is your sense of resolution, justice, recompense, anything of that nature? Or is it just kind of like...
There really isn't any justice. I mean, for being honest, for the soldiers who were held accountable, the penalty is somewhat minor. No one's charged for murder. No one is held accountable for sexual assault or some of the major, grievances. And that's pretty much about it. It's like a few hands get slapped on the wrist and then that's it. And it's completely unsatisfactory given the atrocities that took place.
And there is a shift that happens politically, kind of. In the 2008 election, both presidential candidates will call this torture, will oppose the use of torture, and that matters. But it's not justice. It's not recompense for what happened. It is a moment of recognition, and it is a moment that passes. And in the
2008 election, I think Obama is the one who's able to distinguish himself by pointing out that Hillary Clinton voted for the war and he voted against it, and that's probably one of the key factors in that election, in that primary. So yes, this plays into that story for sure. All right. The one other little tidbit here, I didn't bother to go look it up because I didn't want to, but apparently there was an SNL cold open about Abu Ghraib in like 2004, 2005, and I'm just like, oh, God. No thank
poor
you.
Taste.
But,
poor taste.
I think more than anything, that shows kind of how, I lived through that era, how comfortable we were just living in this ambience of awful, dark behavior, I think. Yeah.
I just feel like Gladiator, like, are you not entertained? Like that
Bloodlust.
kind of like the feeling of just like, I cannot get over the bloodthirst. It just makes no sense. Like, and that's sort of what this moment was.
And just a reminder that the cruelty is the point is not an innovation of the last 5 years.
Totally. And Kellie, your work is evidence of that, going back many, many, many decades. But all right, we will leave it there. Thank you, as always, Nicole Hammer.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
When Darby looked at the photos, he first saw shots of life in Iraq, but then came upon the pictures that launched the scandal, starting with this pyramid of naked Iraqis.
I didn't realize it was Iraqis at first, because we lived in prison cells too.
And you thought this was maybe Americans? You thought that
I had no idea.
Soldiers
I had
goofing off.
no idea. I laughed. I looked at it, and I laughed, and then the next photo was of Grainer and England standing behind them. And I was like, wait a minute, this is the prison. These are prisoners. Then it kind of sunk in that they were doing this to prisoners. This was people being forced to do this.
Radiotopia.
From